I'm Frederick. They told me this in a whisper. Now, you'll hear it. Enjoy watching. Malik woke before the alarm went off, not from the sound, but from the feeling that something about this morning was especially heavy. The room felt cramped in the grey light of dawn, the air thick as before a thunderstorm. Water dripped from the ceiling. The pipe was leaking again. Tiger, his tabby cat, sat by the window, watching the few people walking through the fog. Malik turned to the side, reached for his crutch, and sat slowly on the edge of the sagging mattress. His leg, the one that had been hurting him every morning since the accident, was a dull ache. He clenched his teeth and inhaled, forcing himself not to scream. He was 12, and he already knew that screaming was a luxury you couldn't afford if you lived in a neighborhood where even crying was an accusation. In the kitchen, an old frying pan hissed as his mother fried the last of the potatoes, suppressing a cough. Malik walked in, quiet as a shadow, and she said without turning around, "It's cold again. Put your hood up. Go with Tiger. He's smarter than most adults." She smiled, but there was no humor in her eyes. Tiger jumped onto Malik's shoulder and nuzzled his cheek gently. It was their ritual, a warm, silent support before going out into a world that was always against them. The yard was bathed in the dim light of a street lamp. Raindrops fell slowly from the eaves, and Malik, leaning on a crutch, moved toward the bus stop. The people stood silently. He felt their gazes, slippery as slime. He didn't know their names, but he knew their expressions. There he is again, with the cat, like a clown. Tiger sat at their feet, peering into each one as if he could read their souls. The bus pulled up, the headlights blinding, and the door opened with a guttural hiss. Malik climbed the steps, heavily as always. The driver said nothing. He just watched. The people on board parted reluctantly, leaving a narrow path, as if he were carrying leprosy. He sat by the window, placing the cat next to him. Tiger curled up, pressing himself against the boy. The bus moved, graffiti flashing past the windows, grey buildings, trash cans where children sometimes rummaged. Malik knew every pothole on this route. He felt them through his crutch, through his spine, into the depths of his heart. The front door of the bus opened again, not at a stop, just like that. And there he was, white, tall, in a new uniform. His gaze was like a knife, a patrolman. The people fell silent. Even the engine seemed to have stopped. He walked down the aisle slowly, his gaze catching on everyone until he stopped in front of Malik. "What's that you got there?" he asked, pointing at Tiger. The voice was even, but with something slippery, dangerous. "This is my cat. He is always with me," Malik whispered. "Animals are prohibited on public transport, especially smelly cats, and especially with people like you," the policeman hissed, grinning. The boy froze. The driver was silent. The passengers turned away. The cat hissed quietly. The policeman leaned down, grabbed Malik by the jacket, and yanked him up. "Get off the bus, right now, or I'll call the police." The boy screamed in pain, not so much physical as humiliation, from the world silently watching him being reduced to nothing again. He tripped, fell on the step, and the cat darted after him. It was drizzling outside, and the water instantly soaked into his pants. Malik lay pressed against Tiger. No one came out. No one approached. The bus doors slammed shut and drove away, leaving the two of them in the mud. The world hissed like a broken television. His heart was beating too loudly. He stood up slowly, without saying a word. He didn't cry. He just walked, slowly, through the cold, as if every movement cut into his flesh. Tiger walked beside him, his paws wet, mud clinging between his toes. The boy felt his chest tighten with every step. Why, he thought, but he knew he would never get an answer. Never. He knew. They didn't want to see him, not because of the cat, because of the color of his skin, because of the crutch, because of the silence he lived in. On the way, he met a man with a newspaper. He looked at Malik, then at the cat, snorted, and crossed to the other side. A woman in a suit approached the car, glanced at the child in the puddle, and quickened her pace. Even the old woman with the cart looked away. People were deaf. The people were dead inside. But Tiger was alive. He stopped when Malik fell. He purred when the boy gasped. He was the one holding on. The only one. Ahead was the street where teenagers had set fire to a migrant store last summer. The charred words "Get out" were still visible on the wall. Malik knew the school wasn't waiting anymore. He knew he was late. But he kept going because he had to. Because if you didn't keep going, you would disappear completely. And with every step he took, he felt the policeman's gaze burning into the back of his neck, even from a distance. He knew this man remembered him, and it was a threat. He knew they would meet again. Tiger stopped, his fur standing on end. He looked into the alley. Malik didn't immediately understand what was there, but then he held his breath. Someone was standing in the alley, a shadow, tall, a cigarette smouldering in his fingers. Then it was gone, just disappeared. Malik gripped his crutch tighter. He didn't say a word. He just kept walking, because he had no other choice. The next day, the sky was clear, as if after a storm, but there was something suspicious about the light. The blue shadows, too clear, too clean for the streets where decades of dirt had soaked into the asphalt. Malik came out of the house again, his hood pulled down over his face, his shoulders slumped, Tiger at his side like a ready soldier. They were silent, as always. They were too loud in their silence. People were watching again. The same faces, the same judgmental looks, the same driver, carved from wood. When the bus pulled up and the doors opened, something changed inside. As if the air had grown thicker. It was unnaturally quiet. Malik sensed that something was wrong. He stepped inside, slowly, as if into water with a dangerous current. At that moment, from behind, straight from the sidewalk, a man climbed onto the bus, his presence making everyone shrink. Tall, with a sharply trimmed beard, muscular, with a strong jaw and eyes the color of stainless steel. The new police uniform fit him perfectly, like something out of a brochure for white fear. A badge on his chest, a holster on his hip, a barely noticeable tattoo on his arm, cross lightning bolts, a symbol Malik had seen on internet forums that hated people like him. It was Officer Branson, a new patrolman, recently transferred to the area, allegedly for disciplinary conflicts that no one bothered to investigate. He walked in without looking at the driver. His face showed neither irritation nor interest. It was the face of a hunter confident of his prey. He walked past the row of seated people, white women cowering as if afraid to even look at him, an old man with a newspaper looking away, school children with headphones frozen in place. Branson stopped in front of Malik, who sat in the same place he always did. Tiger lay curled up at his feet, as if he knew better than to disturb him. The cop looked down at him, the way you might look at something ruined on the sole of a shoe. "You again," he said, emotionless. Malik looked up. "I'm just going to school." "With the cat?" Branson asked, his eyebrows raised. "He's quiet. He doesn't bother me. He's always with me." Branson chuckled, but there was no warmth in the grin. It wasn't a laugh. It was a judgment. He leaned closer. "Are you stupid, son? I said no pets. Or don't you read? Or maybe reading isn't something you do in your family?" Silence fell again. No one moved. People hid their faces, as if from a fire. Malik felt the blood rush to his cheeks. He wanted to say that he had a certificate, that the cat was his emotional support, that it was legal. But he knew the laws in these walls meant nothing if you were black. He opened his mouth, but Branson was already talking. "Listen, I'm sick of this shit. You and your lame circus act and your stinking cat. I saw you guys put on a show here last night. You think you're special. You think you deserve sympathy. A disabled kid with a pet. This isn't a Netflix movie. This is the real world, son. Out here, you're just trash on a seat." Tiger hissed softly. Malik put his hand on his back. Branson jerked his holster back, not drawing his gun, just making the gesture. His voice grew louder. "Get off the bus, now, no talking, or I'll drag you out myself. And don't think your mum or anyone's coming for you. You're all the same. You only open your mouth when the cops are around. And when it comes to the law, you jump in as victims. I'm tired of this whining." The boy clutched his crutch, trying to stand up, but his hand was shaking. The driver still didn't intervene. He looked in the mirror, but his eyes were dead. Branson stepped closer, grabbed Malik by the backpack and yanked. The boy barely held on. Tiger howled, jumped between them, but the policeman kicked him. The cat flew a couple of meters, hit the side of the bus, hissed, and curled up next to Malik again. People gasped. Someone even covered their mouths with their hands, but no one said anything. Branson grabbed the boy again and literally pulled him out. He threw him on the steps and then kicked the backpack after him. You and your pet, now on foot, and tell your mother to teach you to respect authority. Malik lay on the wet asphalt, the cat next to him, and he heard the bus door slam. The car drove away. Everyone drove away. The world moved on without him. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just lay there, tasting dirt and blood in his mouth. Tiger stood up slowly, limping. He licked the boy's face. It was the only gesture that didn't contain contempt. Malik sat up heavily, as if every bone in his body was resisting. His hands were shaking. He couldn't speak. He just stared ahead, at the empty street. And then there was a click. At first he didn't understand. A click, like a camera. He turned sharply. A man in a coat, holding a phone in his hand, stood around the corner, watching. He was looking at Malik and taking a photo. When their eyes met, the man put the phone away and walked away. Not a word, just walked away. Malik was alone again. He understood. This neighborhood is not just a dangerous place. It is a place where you can be humiliated in front of everyone, and no one will even raise their voice. This is not just systemic racism. It is a ritual. It is a daily reminder that you are superfluous, that your pain is entertainment, that your voice is a nuisance. He knew tomorrow it would all happen again. And he was right, because this was not the end. This was only the beginning. Branson now knew his face. Tiger was now an enemy to the authorities, and society chose to stand aside. Let's take a short break and ask you to write in the comments what city you are from and whether you have had similar stories in your life, and also subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the continuation of the story. We continue. Malik walked along the wet asphalt, each step giving pain to his leg and a cold that penetrated to the bones, and the rain poured over his head in a solid curtain, as if the world was trying to wash away all life from him, leaving only one feeling of endless humiliation. The stick on which he leaned slipped from his hands, and he fell straight to his knees, feeling how the dirt ate into his skin, into the cracks of his tight jeans, and drops of rainwater mixed with hot blood that began to ooze from small scratches on his elbows. Tiger, frightened by the fall of his owner, his fur stuck to his wet clothes, rushed to him, gently rubbed his muzzle against his palm, reminding him that he was not alone. Malik tried to get up, but the stick cracked at an angle, and he cheerfully lashed at his ankle. He groaned, feeling a piercing pain, and his hand slid along the asphalt, leaving a wet mark. The footsteps in the empty yard were a ringing echo of loneliness. Not a single door opened to greet them. Not a single window brought a ray of sympathy. Suddenly, an old Jiguli drove around the corner. The driver abruptly turned at the edge of a puddle and doused them with a fountain of dirty water, so that Malik and the cat were immediately drenched from head to toe, and the trade word torn from. The man's lips sounded like a fired bullet. "Get soaked, nigger, since you can't stand on your feet." The voice was muffled, indifferent. After it, the echo of the crowd froze. Several teenagers throwing bags of garbage looked at each other and laughed without saying a word, but their laughter sounded like approval. Malik clenched his jaws, but did not answer. He knew that any word now would turn into a new reason for ridicule or threats. He spat the dirt from his lips, saw black stains on his palm, like the seal of someone else's cruelty. Tiger stood up on his hind legs, his paws wrapped around the boy's leg, trying to caress him, but every movement the tiger made was accompanied by a quiet purr of pain. The cat's paw pads were also wet, and dirt was stuck to them. Malik leaned down, ran his fingers through the fur, and felt his heart thicken with gratitude for this touch through the wet fur. He knew that Tiger would never leave him, even when the whole world turned away. He took off the cat's jacket, wrapped it around the broken cane to somehow fix its remains, and stood up, stepping on the stick with the remains of piercing fragments. Each step was a feat, but there was no other way. He walked further along the street, where houses, like monolithic cells, towered on both sides, exposing all the cracks and streaks of aging. Стены были исписаны граффити. Нет ни герам и жид и мышь, путь прочь. Другие выражения, полные ненависти и пожеланий насилия. Малик не мог отвести взгляд. Эти слова напоминали, что его цвет кожи и его инвалидность – причина для презрения. Он обвел глазами закрашенные крылья ангела в пыли и почувствовал, как внутри все сжимается. Он прошел мимо группы мужчин в пыльных спецовках, которые курили на обочине, и один из них, заметив мальчишку с палкой и пушистым котом на плече, выкрикнул: «Смотри-ка, маменькин сынок с киской на прогулке!» Они рассмеялись, и один бросил окурок так, чтобы он чуть не попал в голову Тайгеру. Малик услышал, как кот всхлипнул, зажмурился и крепче прижал голову к плечу мальчика. Он хотел защитить друга, но знал, что у него нет сил. He glanced at the workers, who continued to smoke as if they had not hurt, and he felt invisible again. In the mirror of the puddle, he saw a fragmentary reflection, a face drenched in rain and tears, eyes swollen, a cheek caked with dirt. He raised his hand and ran his fingers over his cheek, removing someone else's dirt from his face. But underneath it remained his own, which could not be washed away. He inhaled, and the air mixed with the soot and decay of the city entered his lungs, leaving a bitter aftertaste. Further on, he met a woman carrying a bag of bread, and she recoiled at the sight of them, as if his dirt might infect her. She walked away, pushing the cart as if Malik was standing in the way of her normality. His heart sank, but he did not lower his gaze. He knew that if he did, he would break completely. He walked into a narrow alley between two concrete blocks, and there he saw another passerby, a tall man in a black hooded coat, his face hidden in shadow, but his voice hoarse and cold. "Where are you going, scoundrel?" Malik blinked, trying to decide if there was an ounce of doubt in those words, or if this was just another line in the endless list of insults that humans filled their darkness with. The man stepped forward, looking into the boy's eyes, and Malik felt a shiver run down his spine. He trumpeted with his crutch, but the man lowered his hand as if to strike, but instead suddenly turned calmly and walked past without saying another word. The boy's heart was beating like a bird thrashing in a cage. He threw back his hood and shook himself, but drops of rain clung to his eyelashes, obscuring his vision. Tiger meowed softly, and Malik swallowed, feeling a lump of unbidden emotion in his throat. Hurt, fear, loneliness. He moved again, leaning on his cane as if it were his last bastion of life, scraping it along the wet asphalt until the concrete turned into puddles and potholes that held the remains of garbage and smelled of rot. And then he heard laughter. Childish, like the whims of fate, hoarse from tobacco smoke and alcoholic potion. He turned onto the next street and saw a group of teenagers drinking alcohol behind a house. They saw him and burst into a stream of words that hit like a belt. "Oh, look, a cripple with a cat. Couldn't you find yourself a normal toy?" They threw an empty bottle at him, but they missed, and it fell with a crash, scattering across the wall. Malik felt a drop of the drunken wine hit his face, and his nose stung with the smell of alcohol and burning. He didn't stop. He knew that if he stopped, he would be here forever, in this musty circle of insults and ridicule. He put his hand in his pocket, fished out a few coins his mother had given him for lunch, and threw them forward. But the teenagers didn't even pay attention, as if his pity was worth less than that small change to them. He turned, threw his cane away, and Tiger jumped into his hand, running his palm over his fingers, and he grabbed the cat by the back of the neck and hugged him to his chest. He moved on, finally breaking free from the neighborhoods where the concrete was soulless and the people were even more soulless. He came to a park where, as a child, he had once seen the sun play through the trees on the asphalt, but now the park was gloomy, flooded, and smelled of garbage. He sat down on the bench, all his clothes stuck to his body so that he could feel every drop of rain running down his back, every grain of dirt curling into lumps on his skin. He put Tiger on his lap, his hand stroking his wet fur, and the cat dug its claws into his pants, clinging as if trying to say, "I'm with you, brother." Malik closed his eyes, tears streaming down his cheeks again. But these were no longer tears. From the pain in his leg, or from the cold, these were tears from the fact that this world allowed itself to be so big and so cruel at the same time. From the fact that even in a drop of rain, he felt humiliation, and in every sound an indirect accusation of his own weakness and otherness. He hugged the cat tighter and whispered, "We will survive, Tiger. We will still get home." And even though the cold and concrete around him never stopped pressing, and even though every sound was filled with condemnation and hatred, he knew that this path was his path, and if he could walk it with a cat on his shoulder, he would be able to stand up to anyone who wanted to humiliate him again for being different. When the pale light of the lanterns floated outside the window, as if hesitating whether it was worth lighting this night, Malik and Tiger returned home. The boy with a wet stick on his shoulder, the cat with almost no dry spot on his fur, and their souls were even more soaked than their clothes. The mother noticed them from afar. Standing at the door, she pressed her hand to her chest, as if she already had a premonition of trouble. Malik knocked so slowly, as if each blow was an attempt to stay on his feet. And when the door opened, in the hoarse light of the dim lamp, she saw his face, covered in dirt and tears, his gaze dull, and next to him, an exhausted cat, whose whole body was shaking. The mother almost fainted. "Malik, what's wrong with you?" Her voice trembled, but not from fear for her son, but from anger and helplessness. He did not answer at once, lowering his head, and Tiger hissed quietly, as if protecting his master even at that moment. "I was kicked out," he squeezed out, his fingers clutching the handle of his cane, and new tears streaming down his cheeks. His mother grabbed his shoulders, trying to warm him up, but she herself was shaking from the cold and pain. Who? Who dared?" He could not repeat everything at once because his voice was stuck in his throat, but after several attempts he squeezed out, "A policeman. He kicked me off the bus, insulted me, called me nothing, said that I did not deserve a place next to ordinary people." At that moment, his mother groaned like a man who had been hit in the chest and let go of her son. As if afraid of breaking down completely, she led him to a chair, sat him down, tore off his socks, looked at his reddened legs, scratched and covered with abrasions. Then she looked up at the cat, whose eyes were shining with fear and fatigue. She ran her fingers through his wet fur, as if asking for forgiveness for not protecting him. Malik listened to his mother sobbing, quietly at first, holding back, as if she had no right to make a sound, and then louder, bursting into screams that broke off on the walls, echoing with helplessness. "I'll call them," she said, grabbing the phone. But the useless station that had extorted her answered the receiver, only to interrupt the beeps with a soulless machine. "All operators are busy." Every second of silence on the line sounded like a hammer struck at a still living heart. She called again and again, beeps, and then a recording. "Your call is very important to us. After the signal, leave a message." Her hand clenched into a fist, and she wanted to hit the wall, but she couldn't. She had useless iron in her hands. Malik was silent, watching his mother suffer, and for the first time he thought, if the police have become a place of pain, then where else to go? If the authorities only increase your suffering. The child's gaze ran over the walls of the apartment, where there were old photos, a happy Malik with a kitten on his shoulder, before the accident. Then his mother alone, sad, while her son was in the hospital. Then him with his the papers that confirmed his disability. He wanted to tear up these papers, throw them out into the street, so that they would no longer remind him of him as different. His mother, having lowered herself onto a kitchen chair, grabbed the phone in an attempt to call social services, but they told her that complaints against police officers are considered for up to 3 months, and suggested that she submit an electronic appeal. "Are you serious?" she breathed out. There was so much sarcasm and despair in her words that Malik became even more scared. He looked at the cat, who was now scratching the floor with his claws, trying to get up, but his paws were shaking. His mother leaned over and lifted Tiger into a basket lined with an old blanket. He grumbled, then quieted down. His mother looked at her son. "You're staying home, not going to school again." Malik exhaled loudly, a confession. He felt as if he had been robbed of his last right. The right to be a child, to go to school, to be friends with his classmates, to have some hope for a childhood. "Mum, what about your friends?" he asked quietly. His mother turned away, unwilling to look at her son. "You don't have friends where you're not wanted, and that's crime enough." Malik fell to his knees by the closet where his dolls and old toys were kept, and ran his fingers through the dust, collecting memories of a time when people were kinder. He remembered a classmate giving him a chocolate bar, his classmates applauding at a school performance, his mother stroking his head when he was learning to walk after surgery, and suddenly, the patrolman's words came into his mind. "You're trash that's a shame to clean up." He felt everything inside him shrink, as if his heart had been packed into a box and thrown into a far corner. "I won't go anymore," he whispered, and these words became the funeral message of childhood. His mother came up and grabbed him by the shoulders. You have to live." But in her eyes he saw the same horror and helplessness as in his own. That same night, teenagers wandered under their windows, throwing empty bottles, shouting insults. "Every black man with a cat is a potential terrorist. Get this black creature away from us," and laughed when something knocked on the pipes. Malik waited for the night to deepen, but it did not become softer. It only filled with new offensive remarks and the echo of his own suffering. His mother closed the shutters and turned on the old TV to the news, which was reporting on another protest against migrants and antisocial elements. The presenter spoke in an even tone, and the footage of demonstrations where people shouted, slogans like "white purity" and "separatists on your knees" swirled on the screen like a cycle of a merciless world. Malik watched it, and his heart turned over. Why are they all like this? He asked himself. His mother hugged him, but he felt that even her embrace had become colder now, because she felt responsible, afraid, and helpless. She whispered, "Forgive me. Forgive me for not being able to protect you." He closed his eyes, hugged his mother and Tiger at the same time, and the three of them trembled with fear and with the fact that love is sometimes too small to drive away the darkness. In the semi-darkness of the kitchen, the clock ticked slowly, and each tick seemed like the tramp of an approaching disaster. He lay between two beings that meant everything to him, and he knew that tomorrow would be a new nightmare, because the world never stops when your skin and your weakness give rise to ridicule and hatred. But in this silence, mixed with the sound of rain outside the window and the distant barking of dogs, Malik felt for the first time. He would no longer go where he was not wanted. And this was pitch darkness, which did not make him warmer. Night fell on their small apartment, covering the windows with thick curtains, but even they could not hide the oppressive emptiness that settled in the rooms, where in every corner there was a feeling of heaviness and hopelessness. Malik lay on the old sofa, wrapped in a thin blanket, and Tiger pressed himself against his sides, sliding his soft fur over the boy's skin, as if checking that he was still alive and did not move away a step, his ears constantly moving, catching the quietest sounds, as if the cat knew that the darkness was not a friend, but an open door to a hostile world. Behind the wall, the ticking of the clock echoed in the chest. Each strike seemed to hit the nerves, making the heart beat faster, and breathing became intermittent and shallow. The walls seemed thinner with every second. The sounds of the entrance, the rare knock of the elevator, the rustle of bags of garbage on the stairwell, all this sounded too loud, as if someone was cutting the space into pieces, trying to awaken their fear. Malik clenched his fists, trying to drive away the cold that was creeping through the empty cracks of the floor, but every movement brought back the pain in his leg and the memories of an evening of humiliation, when his mother tried to find justice to the point of tears, and the world answered her with emptiness. The cat purred softly, lying down next to him, and Malik lowered his hand, ran his fingers over the smooth fur, but even this feeling of warmth could not drive away the shiver that ran down his spine. Suddenly the silence was broken by a sharp, unexpected sound, a stone hitting the bathroom glass, creating a small crack and making his heart jump into his throat. The boy shuddered, instinctively pressing Tiger closer, and Tiger raised his fur, throwing his head up to the ceiling. His ears began to ring. But this sound was followed by another, the scraping of a blackened with time handle at the window, a light tapping on the windowsill, like someone's nail was pricking wood. Malik, remembered all the childhood threats once thrown at the entrance. But now he felt that the world had turned into an arena for their arrogant horror, and someone, hiding in the darkness, decided to add a new level of fear to him. He moved forward, through the noise of his heart, assessing the distance to the door and window, feeling how a threat sits in every molecule of air. Then a scrap of paper appeared under the window glass, released along with another stone, which crunched right at the threshold, leaving characteristic shards on the bare floor, like a hint of a broken fate. Malik, crushing the cat to himself, got into his hands, trying not to make a sound, but felt how everything was burning from fear and anger at the same time. Gah! The handwriting was inaccurate. The letters were either tilted to the right, then he was sharply soaked, but the meaning was clear and cold. Blooded, an adult thought out, as if the author tried to invest in an anger, and every word sounded like a shot in the heart, speaking out of humiliation and hatred, which the world was so calmly divided into a motorcade. Thirsty hand, feeling the blood rush to the fingertips. Tiger, breathing heavily, purred loudly, trying to return at least a drop of calm to the boy. But even the cat, accustomed to being strong, now seemed scared, his eyes shining like two small spotlights in the night. Malik put the paper in his pocket, not agreeing that this world has the right to decide who is worthy of sitting on the bus and who is not. But inside, he felt that the border between they and us was cut too deep and painfully. He rolled the window slightly open, letting in the damp air mixed with the smell of sewage and the bitterness of rain, and then closed the window behind him, as if trying to fence off the horror. But he understood that fear had already penetrated. Inside, settled in every inch of the apartment, and now no locks on the doors would protect them from new attacks. Tiger climbed back onto the couch and curled up against his master's chest, and Malik sat next to him, holding his finger on the broken cane, feeling every crack and unevenness, as if it were a symbol of how broken he was, like this harsh night. He looked into the darkness, trying to find some shadow of hope, but he saw only the silhouettes of furniture and the reflection of street lamps that were breaking through the window, like interrogators looking for a weak spot to strike again. At that moment, he heard the quiet but distinct sound of footsteps under the windows. Somewhere below, the muffled voices of teenagers were heard, who were probably standing outside the house and exchanging glances, enjoying the weapons that adults had left in their hands, impunity and contempt for the lives of others. He imagined them joking, wondering if the boy would open the window and glance back at the paper message of hate. And he felt something inside him ache, like strings had trembled, and the world was spinning around a point where they had never existed. His mother was asleep on the next couch, her steady snores hiding the fact that she too was desperately trying to forget the night before, when the filth of her American dream had been unleashed on her son and her cat. But even in her dreams, she could hear the roar of police cars and the voice of a patrolman calling the boy a scumbag and a buffoon who had been deprived of his right to a normal life. Now she could only hope that sleep would protect her from the nightmares of reality, and Malik from further attacks of hatred. But the silence of the night, filled with these endless blows of time, proved that the task was not to fall asleep, but to wait for dawn and understand that even if this world tries to break you in silence, the only chance to survive is not to remain silent, not to hide, but to hold on, like Tiger holds on to the boy, humming a saving melody with all his might. Malik stroked the cat's ears, and together they listened to the night, in which the truth was breaking out. Fear can come at any moment. It sits behind every corner and waits for the right moment to throw a stone and a note at you, to write your humiliation in a child's handwriting and burn your heart with adult hatred. But at the same time, they knew that as long as they were here, alive, and as long as there was enough air to whisper their name, they would not break. And Tiger quietly, almost unnoticed by the boy himself, touched his palm with his nose, as if to say, "I'm here, I'm with you." And this simple tough love was enough for the night to again become not a place of defeat, but a place of testing, in which they got to know their own courage. Let's take a short break and ask you to write in the comments what city you are listening to our stories from, and whether you have had similar cases in life, and also subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the continuation. We continue. The next morning, Malik woke up long before dawn, his body aching in every joint, as if yesterday's humiliation had left burns on his skin, and with each attempt to rise he felt the blows of the cold floor ricochet along his spine. He sat on the edge of the bed, clutching his cane, wet from the night's rain, and stood up slowly, feeling how every drop of peeled dirt and blood froze in the folds of his skin. Tiger was already sitting by the door, pressed against the wall, staring with wide eyes, and when Malik stood up, the cat jumped up onto his shoulder, trying to convey at least a drop of courage. He put on wet jeans and a hoodie, his hand shaking when he zipped it up, but in the mirror he saw not only a broken reflection, but also determination. He would go, because there was no other way. His mother stood at the threshold with a cup of hot tea. He smelled the bitterness and fatigue when she handed him the mug, but did not say a word, simply hugged him by the shoulders and handed him a damp handkerchief with which he wiped away tears and dirt. She pulled up her hood, threw her coat over her shoulders, lowered her gaze and, without asking permission, took his hand, as if in this way she was trying to share the pain. They went out into the street, where it still smelled of wet asphalt and the premonition of a new nightmare. Malik carefully took the first step, his legs squeezed with pain, and he almost collapsed. But Tiger jumped up to his leg, tore his fur against the folds of his pants, and quietly purred, encouraging him. His mother hugged him around the waist, helping him to stand up, and they moved along the grey houses, whose windows were closed with shutters, as if everyone around agreed to hide their faces from them. The car drove up to the stop. The driver with the suckers slowly opened the window and, noticing the couple, grinned. Again this freak and his cat. Malika threw it with a limit. Go back where you have a place, a black man, with your circus. And passing further, did not even accelerate his pace and looked over his shoulder, satisfied with his hands, and repeated, keeping up. But the words are sinking in the stream of some slurred sounds. Brakes, the hum of the bus engine, the creak of iron doors opening to meet the most merciless test. When they approached the stop, there were already several people standing there. Teenagers with aerosol cans, an old lady in a jacket splattered with paint, a young man in a suit with a briefcase, whose tie was carelessly tied, and all of them, seeing Malik, perked up, but did not show an ounce of compassion. The teenagers reached into their pockets for phones. The old lady stood behind him, waiting for the moment to whisper, Stay away, boy. You can be detained for disturbing the peace. The young man quietly clicked the camera, as if recording a unique specimen of a rare animal. The bus pulled up with a screech of brakes, and when the driver turned his head towards them, at first he wanted to close the door, but made sure that Malik was hugged by his mother, and the cat was calmly settled on the boy's shoulder, and without saying a word, he opened the door. The bus was already half empty inside, which gave Malik hope that maybe no one would notice today. But as soon as he put his foot on the step, a woman in a white coat exclaimed, "Oh no, him again!" And everyone turned around. Someone applauded. Someone shouted, "We'll see how you and your cat get on." One of the men in a black leather jacket said, "I'll take a picture of you and your cat and post you on the internet as a weirdo." And several passers-by standing at the exit laughed in response. Policeman Branson, as if he heard these shouts, at that moment got out of his partner's cell phone pocket, showed his badge and stepped into the bus. His gaze was icy, as if any step Malik took promised a new round of humiliation. He approached the boy, pointed his finger at the cat and said, "I told you that animals are not allowed? Or is that all your credentials mean?" At these words, the whole bus fell silent. The policeman's colleague laughed indifferently, and the driver pushed the wheel back, as if Malik's place was not behind the wheel at all, but somewhere in the open. His mother almost covered her face with her hands, but she clenched her fists and said, "He has a right to support." But Branson chuckled, "Not here. Your rights end here when someone has trash under their seat." He sighed, putting away the keycard, and headed for the exit. The bus moved, and as it began to move, the dizzying noise and vibration lifted Malik up and down, as if testing the strength of his bones and spirit at the same time. The cat clung tighter to the collar of his hoodie, leaving wet spots, and his mother pressed her hand to his back, as if trying to connect their bodies into a single shield. As they approached their stop, passengers stood up one by one, cursed the cat, whispered threats, and got off with grins, leaving behind empty stares and a sense of unreality, as if they were carrying the echo of someone else's malice. When the bus finally slowed down before the right stop, the driver, without meeting Malik's gaze, lazily waved his hand, indicating that they should get off, and added with a laugh, "Well, good luck, circus performer," before closing the doors in front of them. Malik's mother took his hand, and they found themselves again on the damp asphalt, strewn with puddles and fragments of someone else's hatred. He took a step forward and felt the crutch in his fingers grow colder, as if remembering that he was now his own master and his own hostage at the same time, because to go on meant to take blows every day, and each dawn brought new wounds, but they went on. Tiger jumped off his shoulder and slipped under Malik's arm, who bent down to stroke his head, and the cat rubbed against his pants as if to say, "I'm going with you until the end," finally opening up the road before them, covered in cold lantern light. And as they turned the corner, their mother whispered, "We'll get through this," and Malik gritted his teeth and took another step that echoed throughout his being, a step through the pain. At the intersection where the streets converged like the bones in the skeleton of the city, Malik stopped, feeling the heartbeat surrendered in the temples, and the rain from the night puddles became a harbinger of a new nightmare. And in the light of a rare lantern, he saw a figure in a dark hood. As if cut out of the night, a stranger made a step in ahead of his gut. L seemed to be stretched as a bowstring, and from the pocket of the coat he grabbed a gun, chrome by moving, as if demonstrating power over death. To humiliate. Malik froze. His leg trembled treacherously, and the hand clutching the strap of the backpack did not dare to loosen its grip, because this bag contained not only a school uniform and textbooks, there were medical certificates, photos of his favorite comic book characters, and even a photo with his mother, a reminder that he still had ties with humanity which he did not want to betray. Tiger, sensing danger, hissed, arching his back, and in his hissing one could hear all the ancient fury of cats, those very claws that instantly bare themselves in the face of a threat. But the stranger only sullenly mockingly twisted his lips and jabbed the barrel straight into the boy's chest, so that the metal dug into the hoodie over the ribs. "Don't hiss. I'm not one to laugh at cats. I just like to enjoy the fear of a bullet." The man squeezed his fingers on the trigger, and at that moment, the world stopped. The sound of the rain became muffled, and all that was left was the steel barrel, whose cold embrace promised pain, and Malik, whose knees were shaking. But despite this, he could not throw aside his hope. Passers-by standing in the balconies of protective canopies held their breath. No one dared to intervene, because no matter how unfair, this fight seemed to be to the point of disgrace. In their eyes, the boy and the cat had long been strangers, outsiders, marginals, whom one could only look at like an animal in a zoo, in order to then release a new portion of ridicule on social networks. The stranger leaned close to the boy, his face hidden by the shadow of his hood, but his language betrayed a man writhing with the desire to inflict pain. "Give me the backpack, or I will shoot your dirty cat here and now, and you will watch how drops of his blood mix with the rain, and no one will cry for you." The words fell as if cut with a blade, and the night itself became a witness to new tortures. Malik felt panic rising in his chest, but instead of giving in, he took a deep breath, as if it were his last act of freedom before the fight, and whispered, "He is not a toy, and I will not give up the backpack." In response to this, laughter, shrill and wild, from which a chill ran down the spine. "Are you stupid? I tell you, give it to me, you wretch! Or what? Do you want to be thrown out of the bus again?" And this word, bus, sounded so mockingly, as if yesterday's humiliation had not ended, but had only become a new level for the crowd's entertainment. The stranger sharply pulled the trigger, and the shot into the ground tore out a piece of asphalt and raised a column of dirt, which fell onto the stuck puddles, and the echo of the shot flew back to the houses, returning to Malik with a new load of horror. Tiger froze, his fur stood on end, and his eyes shone with panic, but he did not run away. The cat remained nearby, reminding the boy that they were not alone in this battle. The crowd gathered at the crossing now parted, as if respecting the cruelty of force, and no one shouted, "Help!" Everyone was too busy capturing the moment. Someone turned on a phone flashlight, another got ready with a click of shock video. Malik felt a black emptiness of fear growing inside him, but at the same moment he understood. If he gave in, they would both die. Here, on the wet asphalt, among strangers' looks and indifference, there were no other chances. He clenched his teeth, and the empty gaze of the stranger himself, who noticed this spark of resistance in the boy, trembled. Raising the barrel again, he frowned and pulled up the bandage on his sleeve, where barely noticeable traces of blood were appearing. Apparently, these were not the first victims of his distribution of lessons in respect. "Okay," he said, moving away into the shadows. "You have 5 seconds. 2. It was at this moment that Malik took the most desperate step. He took an old cartoon whistle out of his backpack, a gift from the music teacher, and sticking out his hand, pressed on it as hard as he could. A piercing whistle pierced the night, deafening both the stranger himself and all the onlookers around. At that moment, Tiger rushed forward, breaking free from Malik's hands, hissing and spreading his claws, diving under the man's feet. The second fired a bullet into the air, and the echo bounced off the walls as if confirming that life was hanging by a thread. The stranger screamed, recoiled, dropped the gun, and it clanged on the pavement like a final renunciation of power. In the unfading light of the lantern, the boy and the cat stood shoulder to shoulder, their breathing intermittent, but in their eyes burned the same fury that is not eradicated by shots or fear. The crowd, putting on dark masks of indifference, retreated. Someone bent down to pick up a pistol, but at that moment the mother jumped out from behind the corner, covered her son with her body and, leaning on a broken cane, shouted, "Step back! He's my boy!" Her resolute voice, rich with the love and fury of a tiger mother, filled the street, and the nasty laughter died down, giving way to the rustle of footsteps. The police had finally arrived, sirens tore into the night, and the hooded stranger, realizing that his ghostly reign over fear was over, dropped his backpack and disappeared into the shadows. Malik fell to his knees, and Tiger immediately climbed onto his shoulder, and the boy began to cry, not from fear, but from relief and pain. At the same moment, passers-by finally broke through the crowd of indifferent people. Someone handed the mother a handkerchief, a journalist's phone buzzed nearby, and the cat quietly dropped his head on Malik's shoulder, as if to say, "We survived." And in those moments, when the sound of sirens merged with the beating of the boy's heart, Malik understood, even in the deepest humiliation, where words and bullets become a test, the inner core does not allow you to be broken completely, and as long as you hold on to the one who walks next to you, be it a cat or a mother, you are able to withstand any bullets and any insults. When Eliza, exhausted and terrified after the nightmare, stepped onto the sidewalk outside the entrance, holding Malik's shoulder and hugging Tiger, who was wet from the rain, she did not yet know that for the police her own home would become an arena for a de facto arrest without cause. But a second later, Douglas jumped out in front of them, the same lieutenant with a cold look and a tattoo of an ultra-right symbol on his neck, whom they had twice seen at the scene of the incidents with. Their son, and 2 partners in black jackets without identifying marks appeared on his team without warning, like guards of the underworld, and Douglas, without introducing himself or explaining the reasons, sternly blurted out, "Do you have documents? Where is your residence permit and certificate of child support?" He spoke as if she owed her a debt, as if she, a woman the color of tar, had violated the sacred laws of this city with her very presence. Eliza, clutching a bag of groceries and watching her son and cat huddled in the shadow of the fence, tried to explain calmly, "I'm just coming home from a hospital appointment with an orthopedist for Malik. All I have with me is medical certificates, an identification." But her calm voice only increased the irritation on the policeman's face. He frowned, came so close that Eliza could smell the stench of alcohol and tobacco smoke, and suddenly, with thievish movements, ordered, "Hands behind your back. I said documents. Sit quietly until I say the word." She tried to take her passport out of her bag, but he pushed her hand away. The silver bullet from the glance in Douglas's eyes was almost sharper than any gun. Eliza froze, not expecting such a reaction. But in the next split second, the policeman grabbed her by the elbow and, not letting her get a word in edgewise, twisted her arm so hard that her vertebrae snapped and the whole world flashed a spot of pain, after which he yanked her toward the hood of the police BMW and threw her face down, leaving the pads of her fingers digging into the cold metal of the car. His partner commanded, "Handcuffs, now!" And before Eliza could even come to her senses, she heard the bars clanking and the cold metal pulling her hands behind her back. She tried to protest, but Douglas threatened, "Move, and you'll get a charge of resisting." And at the same time his mouth twisted in mockery, as if in front of him was not a person, but sandpaper intended for filing down someone else's dignity. People began to gather around. The old janitor stopped the cleaning. The janitors from the windows went out to see. The passers-by were in a hurry to get around this place, and someone, without raising his eyes, took out the phone and began to shoot. The family turned into a sore one. So Eliza realized, now he will hear the most devilish humiliation and wait for me to finish with this circus. He pulled her further along the hood, and Eliza's knees slid on the cold metal, leaving wet marks as she tried to keep her balance on one foot in her wet shoes. Every step she took was a crunch of humiliation. She almost cried, but the tears, like her voice, were taken away by force and indifference. Douglas threw Malik's backpack onto the back seat of his car and dragged Eliza to the door. "Get in," he demanded, pointing with the handcuff. "And keep your mouth shut. I can hold you as long as I want without a warrant." Eliza, feeling the metal cutting into her wrists until the bones turned white, tried to get a word in again. "But I have a child at home. He's disabled." But Douglas only snorted, pushing the door so hard that it slammed shut with a clang, turning her back to the loud laughter of the doors and the slam of the locked handle. The car jumped up and, siren blaring, tore away, leaving Eliza alone and distraught on the wet asphalt, and panic was pushing behind the backs of those standing. Some faces were distorted with reproach towards the police, but no one even stepped forward to stop the violence. In the distance, the voice of a passerby cut through the silence. "And you thought you would get help? Black and wet cats are only honored here, in this show." And laughter escaped even those who had been watching with alarm a second ago. Eliza found herself trapped, humiliated by the same people who were supposed to protect her, and her heart was burned with a new layer of pain. Now she was not only the mother of a defenseless son and a cat, but also a victim of someone who personified cruelty and systemic injustice. As the car disappeared around the corner, the combined cry of her heartbeat and the creaking of her handcuffs mingled with the sirens of the other patrol cars, and she realized that the only thing left of her life up to that moment was her, consciousness of her own skin color, and her broken faith in justice. A quiet but persistent understanding began to form within her. She now faced a new challenge, one far darker and more heartless than any stone or insult, because the shackles on her wrists were not just metal, they were a symbol of everything this world would do to you if you were not white enough or too weak to resist. And in that moment, everyone on the street knew. They were not heroes, they were spectators of judgment, and no one would save Eliza except her own rage and a mother's love, shackled in irons. Let's take a short break and ask you to write in the comments what city you are listening to our stories from and whether you have had similar cases in life, and also subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the continuation. We continue. The shot rang out with a deafening roar, from which the asphalt shook underfoot and time seemed to stand still. A bullet fired into the sky whistled over the crowd and, curling down, sank into the shoulder of a passerby standing near a snack bar. A middle-aged man in a grey coat clutched his chest. His eyes widened in unexpected pain, and he leaned forward like a doll whose string was suddenly pulled. At the same split second, a rustle of panic ran along the sidewalk. People standing near a kiosk with donuts recoiled as if from an electric shock, threw down plastic cups, and cold coffee gushed onto the cobblestones, mixing with the pouring rain that had not stopped for 3 days. The woman in the beige coat screamed, putting her hands in front of her face, and her scream echoed in the narrow alleys and the dead hearts of passers-by. Many ran without looking back, as if escaping from an unknown monster, and only a few seeing. The wounded man hesitated, hastily pulled on their masks and touched his shoulder. But the pulse was weak, and the blood fell down the coat, forming dark streaks. Malik froze, not having time to take a step back, watching as the man slowly sank to his knees and leaned against the kiosk counter, leaving marks on the dirty white enamel. Tiger hissed, arching his back, and, despite the jagged wound in his shoulder, tenaciously grabbed the boy's trousers, trying to get up. But his paws did not obey, and he collapsed next to his owner, weakening from blood and pain. Malik rushed towards the cat, not noticing anything else around him, only the wet smell of asphalt, the sharp smell of gunpowder, and the steely glint of fear in his eyes. He grabbed Tiger by the scruff of the neck and pressed him to his chest. And although the fur was still warm with life, there was a fear in the cat's eyes that had no end. "Tiger!" he burst out, but the sound was drowned out by the roar of sirens that were approaching, bringing with them the promise of new danger. People, running, crowded around on all sides, craning their necks to see details, and at that moment another shot rang out. This time someone from the crowd was aiming, but he missed, and the bullet with a dull thud crashed into the wall of the house, leaving a black star on the peeling plaster. Malik trumpeted his crutch, looked around, and saw the man, who had already been picked up by his neighbors, lying lifeless, his face covered in a crimson hue, and all around there was a silence that made your heart stop. The grandmother, who had just a moment ago been throwing bags of buns, prayed, covering her eye with one shoulder, begging for mercy. But there was no strength in her prayers, only trembling and hopelessness. Then everything stirred again. The sirens became louder, the flashing lights splashed on the walls of the buildings, and 2 police cars ran in, followed by a heavy jeep with tinted windows. Officers in bulletproof vests jumped out of the doors, and Patrolman Branson, who had not yet washed yesterday's dirt and dust from his uniform, quickly walked towards Malik, not looking at the spilled blood, but only waving his hand at the man in the medic's uniform. "Move away! This is not your problem!" The paramedics pursed their lips but backed away, because there was not only an order in Branson's voice, but also a muffled promise of punishment. Malik, clutching Tiger, pressed the cat to his chest and looked at the policeman, unable to explain that the animal was wounded and that they needed help. "Get that dog!" Branson shouted, and the word dog sounded contemptuous of the child's very life, and he pointed a finger at the cat, ordering the paramedic to tear off the tinsel of compassion. Malik jerked his head up. "He's not a dog. He's my friend. He saved me." But in response, the officer pulled out a handcuff and slammed it on the boy's hand, clinging to the idea of punishing not only the cat, but also the owner for daring to stand next to the wounded. At the same time, the orderlies rushed to the man by the kiosk, but Branson waved his hand. "Do not touch him. I will figure it out who this Blacks and his bastard beast. He is a criminal. Look at this freak," and a real diagnosis of society sounded in these screams. People did not see the victim here, and did not hear the moans of the wounded passerby. They only saw a black boy with an animal, whose policeman already decided for them. Malik fiddled with the half-fainting cat with intricate movements, peering into his half-closed eyes, trying to read hope there. But Tiger's gaze reflected only an abyss of pain and impotent rage. Bullets made the concrete shake every now and then, and somewhere a shot was heard screaming in the air, and another policeman got out of the car with his eyes narrowed, as if assessing how best to humiliate the boy in front of everyone. "Damn it, Branson, leave the kid alone. We have priority for passengers here," another officer said, but his voice wavered like a candle in the wind and did not allow himself to show true compassion. At that moment, Branson came up close to Malik, grabbed him by the jacket and roughly tore the cat from his chest. Tiger, with a long squeal of pain, dropped his head and body and fell to his knees, his fur gushing with blood, and the boy managed to grab him with his paw and hug him, but the policeman tore him out of his hands, crushing the cat in his fist. "I said, the animal out," he commanded, throwing the cat onto the asphalt, and at that very moment the cat began to beg with a quiet squeak, barely moving his paws. Malik jumped forward, feeling neither pain nor fear, but only an unbearable zeal to protect his friend. But Branson poked him in the chest with a baton and shouted, "Back! Don't interfere!" The boy fell back, filling his mouth with the taste of dust and blood, but managed to see how the cat, wounded in the shoulder, tried to rise, moving in circles, and his eyes flickered the last warmth of life, reflecting endless pain and trust. Tears welled up in Malik's eyes, and he rushed furiously at the policeman, who hit him in the knee with his baton, and the boy collapsed on the wet pavement, where blood and rain mixed into one solid river. The owners of the first aid bags from the ambulance finally broke through the police line and rushed towards the wounded passerby and the cat, but Branson swung his baton, not allowing them to touch the criminal and his witness. "Get away! This is an arrest!" he shouted at the paramedic, who, not wanting to get into trouble, retreated, leaving the wounded passerby and the cat without help. The crowd, whose eyes had recently been looking for salvation, was now retreating back, pushing away the fear of responsibility, and only one passerby, who had stepped forward, decided to help. He sat down next to the cat, picked it up, and began to give a pulse, but the law enforcement officer appeared again and forcibly pulled the cat away, shouting, "Don't touch it! This is evidence!" The cat looked at the boy in his last jerks, and in this look there was a flash of gratitude and a request not to forget him, even after the darkness finally took over life. The sirens became more desperate, the cars drove up closer, and when another ambulance pulled up, the doors swung open. But the doctors only glanced at the boy with a bandaged shoulder and whispered, "This is not our jurisdiction," after which they shook their heads and left, and the police were already surrounding Malik, preparing to handcuff him for resisting an officer. At that moment, the boy, kneeling in a pool of blood and rain, looked at the wounded cat, who was no longer moving, and a quiet but unyielding oath flashed in his eyes. "I will achieve justice. I will prove that love is stronger than hate." And even when one of the cars opened the door, and two officers grabbed Malik by the arms, wrapping him in a steel hoop of handcuffs, he did not let go of his gaze from the pile of fur on the asphalt, as if promising Tiger that they would meet again. While the clatter of footsteps, the roar of sirens, and the incessant roar of the approaching crowd were heard behind him, Malik knew the blood spilled today will not be forgotten, and every drop became a new starting point for the fight for the right to be heard and recognized as a person, and not a boy with an animal. The police station greeted Malik with the hum of empty corridors and the steady hum of neon lights, as if the very air here was saturated with indifference and ready-made. Stories in which no glitches could be allowed. Detective Butler, whose uniform still bore traces of yesterday's rain, immediately went before the cameras to make an official statement. The boy turned out to be a provocateur, waving some suspicious object, which provoked the incident, and the cat, apparently, is a wild and dangerous animal, attacking people without any reason. He spoke in a level voice that sent shivers down your spine, especially when the footage of the crime scene flashed across the frame with the police officers' silhouettes out of focus and the boy and his cat seemingly disappearing into an invisible wall of evidence. "Unfortunately, our cameras were not working at the time," he sighed, as if deeply, regretting the technological difficulties. This incident is confirmed only by the words of trusted employees, and the video recordings of eyewitnesses are considered unreliable and have been deleted upon appropriate requests, since they violated the privacy of the participants. At this point, the reporter, waiting for a suitable pause, tried to ask an uncomfortable question. But doesn't the law require that video evidence in the case be preserved? And Detective Butler answered with a slight grin. The law requires that we follow all procedures, and we acted in accordance with the regulations. The pursuit was provoked not by the boy, but by his own animal, which rushed at a man with serious injuries. We were forced to take measures to prevent further violence. These words sounded like a sentence to an innocent person, and they contained so many lies that the audience celebrated them no worse than the Song of the Winners, because in this city one remembered what justice looked like. The press, representing the major tabloids, did not even try to verify the information. Only a cameraman from the TV Review, armed with a camera, and two reporters from the local Novosti Segodnya came to the press conference, who were already scribbling in the active chat. "The police are right," the boy twitched and tried to hide the animal under his clothes. The video from the surveillance camera shows someone kicking on the cat's shoulder, although the real videos of eyewitnesses were deleted by the site administrator without notice, and links to them immediately disappeared from social networks. Journalist Maria Klimova, who asked the second question about the cat and the boy's injuries, was met with a cold silence and a barely perceptible nod towards the cameraman. "Please, next question," and was forced to let the topic go, hiding the microphone in her bag. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, where Malik was taken immediately after the interrogation, the prosecutor confidently claimed that the idiotic act of the boy and his wild cat violated public order and resulted in bodily harm to passers-by, although his own phrases sounded like a slap in the face of any common sense. "We have testimony from a police officer that the boy threatened people with the cat's claws and tried to knock them down, and the footage allegedly confirming this was taken from closed sources." And all the judges around nodded, as if this invisible footage was of much greater value than tiny bullet holes in the wall of a kiosk or traces of blood on the asphalt. Meanwhile, residents of the neighboring houses where the incident took place told other acquaintances that the lower one doesn't turn on when the police need it to, and we saw how the officers themselves incite the crowd against the boy. But their words were drowned out by the general avalanche of official statements that hammered into the minds of ordinary people the thought, "These children with the cat are real provocateurs. If not for them, everything would be different." Even the lawyer hired by Malik's mother could not break through the information noise. His petitions for the provision of archival recordings of the city's cameras were denied. Official letters about their technical malfunction were sent to the court without explanation and with the confident stamp, "Not subject to appeal." When the boy's mother demanded an immediate review of the case and the opportunity to question eyewitnesses, the judge cut her off with the words, "We have a protocol from the patrol officers and an expert opinion confirming that the incident was provocative in nature. The case is closed for execution." All these decisions sounded like a poem of bureaucratic cruelty. No compassion, no desire to get to the bottom of the truth, only fanatical devotion to an imaginary order in which the boy and his cat were initially guilty for existing. Even when journalists from the small independent site Golosne Tolpi published an article with interviews with passers-by who claimed that the cat had jumped not on people but on the attacker's hand, and that the boy had tried to defend himself. Hesitantly, these materials were subjected to a DDoS attack and removed within an hour. Accounts that reposted the links received warnings about violating the platform's policy on inciting hatred, although it was precisely under the guise of fighting hatred that the whole truth about violence and racism was removed. At the editorial office of the major newspaper Utragoroda, the editor-in-chief personally gave the order not to get involved with the scammers spreading fakes about the cat and the boy, stating that high traffic on this topic could damage the publication's reputation and lead to fines for publishing false information. Thus, the powerful levers of power closed in order to prevent light from shining through the thickness of lies. The cameras didn't work. The eyewitnesses missed their daily dose of emotions. The cat is not just wild, he's dangerous. The boy is socially dangerous. And the press is busy with more important topics. And only people on social networks who manage to save screenshots of deleted videos and witness recordings quietly exchange them in messengers, fearing that any public gesture of solidarity could be equated with counteracting law enforcement agencies. When Malik's mother came to the local police officer asking for support, they told her to her face, "There is nothing in your case that we could investigate. Our priority is to prevent protests and maintain social stability." These words sounded like the final sentence for her, a reality where she and her son had long been declared not citizens, but a problem, and their suffering had become just unnecessary noise that the authorities were trying to drown out at any cost. And even when neighbors gathered at night in the stuffy entryways of the block where Malik lived to whisper in their half-sleep, we couldn't believe that the local police officers would dare to lie like that. Their whispers remained an echo in the void, because the truth will never be dragged into the light if you are not ready to fight the silence of official lies. Thus a new chapter of their struggle was woven. The shadow of untruth, the silence of the press, and the inaction of those who swear to serve and protect became the most dangerous weapons against the innocent. And in this darkness, only the reliable memory of who you are can become a burning torch capable of cutting through the veil of lies and returning to you the right to a human name. Let's take a short break and ask you to write in the comments what city you are listening to our stories from and whether you have had similar cases in life. And also subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the continuation. We continue. Malik was released from the interrogation room straight into the cold headlights of the bus that was taking him to a special boarding school for juvenile offenders. And when the doors swung open, a long corridor with iron doors on both sides stretched out before him, reminiscent of a voiceless repository of other people's destinies. The boy stepped inside, feeling the dull beats of his heart ricochet off the concrete walls, and behind him, the doors slammed shut like a coffin lid. At the same time, Tiger, bleeding and frozen in a helpless death whisper, was being wheeled on a gurney through the lobby of a clinic with poor ventilation, where through the dim light of the lamps, you could smell a nauseating mixture of medications and old plastic, and the wind from the corridor carried the smell of antiseptic that harshly cut along the nerves. The mother, catching her breath behind the door of the orphanage, leaned her forehead against the cold glass, which reflected her own reflection. Exhausted features, eyes swollen from lack of sleep, and trembling lips that still whispered her son's name. She held in her hands a printout of calls from the bank and a notice from her employer. She was informed that from today, her services were no longer required because the company cannot afford an employee whose name appears in crime chronicles. And the gold seal on the paper sounded like a whip, scorching the remnants of pride, because the same system that kicked out her child was now throwing her out the office door without mercy. In the reception of the wind, the smell of despair, and the mother clenched her hands in his fists, looking at the nurse, who indifferently handed her the application form for unemployment compensation in the beggarly amount, barely covering the cost of a veterinarian for a tiger. I didn't go where it is not supposed to, then you won't lose feeding. In the offices and houses of neighbours at the TVs, they were scribbled by the running line of excuses for the system. This is not the first time in provocations. Experienced employees participate in training seminars. Animals are prohibited in transport. And these phrases flew over the street, like poisonous beetles taking away the last residues of humanity. At the special boarding school, the doors slammed behind Malik, and the guard poked him in the chest with a baton with a mocking grin. Welcome, little black boy. Here you will be taught how to be one of us, without pity and warmth. And the boy, leaning on a crutch, walked along the icy floor, where his steps echoed like a drum of his loneliness. On the sides stood the inhabitants of the boarding school, children from different shadows of life, drug addicts, thieves, and the same dangerous animals who were thrown into this warehouse of human garbage. And they looked at him without interest, only shuddering from the way his fingers touched the handle of the backpack, where there had been no textbooks for a long time, and households, goods turned into a symbol of invisible punishment. Meanwhile, at the veterinary clinic, Tiger was hooked up to an IV, and the vet, turning his eyes upside down, told his mother, "The chances are minimal, because the bullet hit a vital artery," and these words did not sound like a desire to save him, but rather a statement of a predetermined verdict, as if the cat had already been written off as waste, and his life was just an unforeseen expense. The mother, holding the cat's paw in her hands, felt how piercingly cold the fur was, and tears flowed not from pity, but from anger. How could they kill the soul that saved her son? She remembered how Tiger purred silently on Malik's shoulder, how his warm feet warmed passers-by on windy days. And now this last island of kindness hung on the edge between the world of the living and oblivion. The mother's life was falling apart right away. Without a job, without the right to protect her son, and without hope of saving the cat, she rushed between a children's shelter and a veterinary clinic, paying her last money for 2 bleeding bodies. Neighbours, passing by their house, turned away in disgust, and someone quietly whispered, "You shouldn't have stuck your nose in where you weren't invited. You should have stayed home and not called the police." Now he has problems for the rest of his life. And these conversations, like radioactive waves, penetrated the walls of the Khrushchev-era building, reminding the mother that public opinion is harsher than any shackle. At night, she heard rustling sounds. Part of the boarding school was next door, and through the crack in the window came the snores and groans of boys even less fortunate than her son. And this oral tension was supplemented by the hum of the IVs and the beeping of the equipment in the veterinary clinic, as if the whole world had lost its rhythm, and only a mechanical knock remained, signaling the arrival of a new curse. Malik, sitting on a hard bed without a blanket, wrapped in round-the-clock surveillance by guards, looked at the ceiling, where the lamps cracked without light, and thought about Tiger. He imagined the cat lying in a coma, his eyes deathly closed, and how the solution was dripping into his chest, silently dripping, just as his friend's life was slowly slipping away. He felt that everything inside him was covered with ice of darkness. The cat between life and death. He himself was chained in punishment, and his mother, deprived of the means of existence, became an outcast for those who once called a neighbor. The only ray of light shone through the broken window of the boarding school corridor. A patch of sky covered with grey clouds, and the boy whispered, "Tiger, hold on, I will return." Although he himself was not sure that this promise would not become a grain of emptiness, his thoughts held on to one hope, to prove his innocence. But the system, like a monster, devoured anyone who tried to touch its rotten walls, and not a single word of the lawyer pierced their concrete. The mother, at that very moment, filled out the completed application form for guardianship and subsidy, but already in the mailboxes they signed a refusal, citing the internal regulations. A minor under criminal prosecution cannot be in the care of parents deprived of the status of a decent family. Her passport hung on the wall as a monument to lost legitimacy, and each notice of debt for the cat's treatment took away the rest of her money for a trip to the shelter. And in this whirlpool of humiliation and racist attacks, from the fact that the boy was locked up and they did not want to save the cat, to conversations behind their backs about the black rot in their lives, the mother and son felt their world had become a narrow cell where even breathing was examined for belonging to ordinary people. But deep in the heart, despite the cold and fear, a quiet knock began to beat. The knock of love and determination not to give up, even if the world turned away, even if the neighbors whispered, "He doesn't have a chance." They knew that the wounded cat and the broken boy were still breathing, and that meant that fate would listen to them as they fought for the right to be heard. The next morning, the world seemed to be immersed in a sleepy slumber again, but in their small apartment, the heart was beating a new rhythm. The mother's phone was vibrating, announcing unexpected news, and when she picked up the receiver, there was barely any hope in her voice. "Mum, look." She handed the device to her son, and Malik, clutching a heavy backpack to his chest, pressed the play button. A recorded shadow flickered on the screen. Policeman Douglas, with a combat turn of the camera, accidentally turned it on at the very moment when he twisted his mother's arm behind her back, threw her on the hood, and then rolled the name of Happiness. Tiger crumpled on the asphalt, onto his knees, and the frames trembled, but not from the rain, but from the anger of the man himself, who became an involuntary witness to how the police, through the prism of hatred, turned justice into a farce. In the record, Douglas mutters, "Chernozh, firing bitch, not a revision," how he clangs handcuffs, as his mother screams in pain, and then silence, with which only sighs of the child trying to hide behind the bulky shadow of an adult fear were shuddered. Malika came out thousands of publications. People demanded an immediate investigation, demanded to punish arrogant executors of official duty, talked about systemic racism, how easy it is to deprive the world who dare to be others, and how transparent the world becomes when you stop the right to speak to those who do not correspond to the mantle of power. But the court, trembling under the pressure of the authoritative opinion, refused to accept the evidence. The video recording does not correspond to the format, violates the privacy of employees, is questioned in authenticity. And these phrases, uttered by judges in black robes, broke Malik's heart into small pieces, because in their eyes he again became a provocateur, and Tiger, a wild and dangerous beast threatening public order. The cat, meanwhile, having recovered enough to be discharged from the clinic, returned home, but only took a few shaky steps, bowing before the one who patiently treated his wound, his injured paw, and then could no longer keep his balance without. Someone's help. Malik picked up the cat, but Tiger no longer ran to meet him, played on the floor, or rubbed against his leg, because in the best traditions of fate's mockery, he had become a cripple, a disabled person among disabled people, and every trembling rustle made him shudder, because now nothing symbolized freedom as painfully as the inability to simply walk. Malik did not appear in the schoolyard that same day. Teachers and classmates talked about the black boy who was thrown off the bus. But no one in the zone of the misfits wanted to come up and call him to class, because fear of authority is even stronger than compassion for someone who has been offended. Until the last day, they wrote letters to the boy. "Come back, we miss you. Don't listen to rumors." But the answers remained an inactive shadow, since Malik had lost faith even in pens with paper and ink. Far from those who huddled to the side, as if only those who had no problems concerned them, the mother discovered that their bank account was empty. Renting an apartment and treating a cat had torn out of her wallet every last bit of respect from her employer and neighbors, who whispered, "See where protests lead. It's better not to crawl out of your hole." And when she returned home late one evening, she heard neighbors discussing in the hallway, "You shouldn't have climbed in. He provoked it himself." These words sounded like nothing less than a sentence, not a trial, not the truth, but a curse from a cruel, petty social mind that had made a choice in favor of its own safety and indifference. Malik was sitting in his room, pulling off his hoodie, and in front of him lay an empty notebook. Next to him on the nightstand was a printout of a hidden note and a sprig of his favorite flower that once grew in the schoolyard and reminded him of the simple beauty of the world. He sighed and picked up his pen, writing with a trembling hand, "I was saved by the one who cannot speak," and the rest was silent. He reread the line, ran his finger over the letter M, as if reviving it, and closed the notebook. Looking into Tiger's eyes, he saw not pity, but strength. It was enough for his friend to be silently near him to give him hope. And at that moment, the boy finally understood. In this world, they are together. They do not wait for anyone else. But together they do not bend before lies and silence. He hugged the cat, shrinking in their shared pain. And outside the window, the rain began to ring again. The same rain that washes away the colors of this city, but cannot take away the shadows hanging in the heart. And although the ending of the story was not a happy ending, the sirens died down, but not because they won, but because silence came after a loud lie. The cat walks with a crutch and sighs because he knows the price of every step, and the boy does. Not return to school because they do not teach how to survive in a world where no one heard their cry. And in this silence, full of unspoken accusations and unfinished destinies, they remain living witnesses to the fact that sometimes silence is louder than any bullet, and the truth is a thin thread of hope that even fear cannot break. Write in the comments what you think about this story and whether you have ever experienced racism in your life. You are very important to us. We value each of you. Subscribe to the channel and like to support us and not miss new episodes. Write in the comments the phrase, "I listened to the end," so that we know that you are with us until the end. Have a nice day.